Great. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone to our panel for potential immigration consequences for South Asians and bipartisan efforts. We're super excited to have Mr. Ira Kurzban, Representative Raja Krishnamoorthi with us today to discuss basically giving our community a primer about the various immigration topics that might affect us in the coming months. We have two great experts here within both sides of the field. So we're super excited to speak to them and see what their thoughts are. And before we get started, we just want to note that none of this constitutes as legal advice, and the opinions of Representative Krishnamoorthi and Mr. Ira Kurzban are their opinions themselves. And yeah, if we have any questions, we'll address them at the end of this panel. And other than that, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Rohit Biswas. I'm the co-immigration chair of the South Asian Bar Association of North America. And this is Mala Bajpai of the Law Office of Mala Bajpai. I'm from Kramer 11. And Mala, I'll give it away to you to introduce our esteemed panelists.
Thanks, Rohit. Before we get started, we wanted to take a quick poll. We know that there are many important issues that in the election today, and we wanted to see if immigration is going to influence who you vote for president. And let's just launch our vote. Oh, it's launched.
Well, that's good. I guess that's why we're tuning in 90%.
%83 said yes, and 17% said no. Those 17%, it's going to be a long hour for you, but we'll enjoy ourselves. Okay, so when we were thinking about the immigration issues that affect the South Asian community the most, some of them that came to mind are visa backlogs, documented dreamers, H-4 dependent work authorizations, and some of the issues that are affecting people coming from conflicted areas in South Asia. So we wanted to reach out to our esteemed panel. I'd like to introduce Representative Krishnamoorthi. He's been a dedicated public servant and advocate for our community, serving the Illinois' 8th Congressional District since 2017. He's been a passionate champion for issues like education, healthcare, and economic opportunity. As a member of the House Intelligence Committee, he plays a critical role in ensuring our national security while also focusing on innovation and job creation. His background as an immigrant, attorney, and small business owner solidifies his commitment to creating a fairer and more inclusive society. Thank you so much for joining us today, Representative.
Thank you.
Also, Ira Kurzban, he's a prominent attorney, leading advocate in immigration law. He's made significant contributions to the field, representing clients before the U.S. Supreme Court and fighting for immigrants' rights for decades. He's also the author of the widely respected Kurzban Immigration Law Book, which is a resource for all legal professions. His commitment to justice and equality has made him a respected voice in the legal community and beyond, and we're really grateful to have him here at SABA for the 4th time. Thank you, Ira.
Thank you.
With that, we wanted to jump into the first issue, which is visa backlog. And so since not everyone here is an immigration attorney, a quick brief overview of the issue is there's an annual limit for how many immigration visas or green cards are issued each year. 226,000 for family-based, 140,000 for employment-based, but no one country can get more than 7% of the total visas in each given year. So the typical trajectory for an immigrant from, say, a South Asian country is coming in on an F1 student visa, then following their studies, they get OPT, optional practical training, which is work authorization related to their field for 1 to 3 years, and then switching to the H-1B visa for specialty occupations. And all along that time, well, from OPT to H-1B, hoping that an employer then sponsors them for a green card, probably through the PERM process, which itself takes 2 to 3 years. And after that, once they have that approved green card petition, then they have to wait for a visa number to become available. And because of that 7% rule, there's created a huge backlog. So we have just in the chat, for our participants, if you're not an immigration attorney, can you guess how long it would take for a bachelor's in computer science, a software engineer from India, to get a green card following getting an approval? We just wanted to see what your thoughts were. So right now, the November visa bulletin just came out, and for other countries not backlogged, it's November 2022. But for India, it's November 2012. It's a full 12 years after their approval. So Ira, can you jump into what are both administrations, what do we know about them, and how are they going to address this issue?
Okay, in looking at this issue, obviously I looked at, the statements that both candidates made on their websites, as well as public statements that were made, and including the Project 2025 report, which I know Trump has tried to distance himself from, but the fact is that all the people who wrote it were the people who were in the administration previously, people like Cuccinelli and others who really kind of take a hard line on immigration and immigrants. So in the analysis that I try to do, I looked at the 2025 report, the prior policies, recent statements, and so forth to give everyone a background on both candidates. So first, I think with respect to Vice President Harris, who I guess is also, in some sense tied to whatever the policies are of the administration as well, her position has been, I think, pretty clear on trying to create more visas. And I have to say, and Mala's heard me say this many times, we have not had any increase in visas for 35 years, almost 36 years, which is ultimately the essential problem, whether one believes that we should end country quotas or not as a way of creating visas. But the bottom line is we need more visas. So one of the things that Harris supported is the border bill, which would make 250,000 new visas available over the next 5 years for people seeking to work in the U.S. She, prior to her position as vice president, she did support the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act, which would have removed the country caps as well. I think people have different views about whether you should do that or not, whether that's good for overall, but she did support it. Trump, I think, in contrast, has done more, and when he was president, focusing on reducing processing, instead of reducing processing times, focus more on eligibility and fraud. He has said, and what they want to do is kind of have an elite program for only the top foreign workers at the highest wages for H-1Bs, although he has said publicly, it's nowhere in the 2025 report and nowhere on the website, but he did say in a podcast that he would give immigrant students who graduated from U.S. universities a, quote, automatic, end quote, green card to stay in the country, especially entrepreneurial students. But we haven't ever seen the details of that, and I'm not sure what exactly that means in terms of what would happen in the future. So that's their positions. We are facing a crisis, as I'm sure Congressman Krishnamoorthi will talk about, a crisis given the fact that we're going to have the CHIPS Act, and the CHIPS Act's in effect. We have a substantial shortage of the numbers of people to do work under the CHIPS Act. And unless we have a transformation of both the H-1B program and a transformation really of permanent residency by issuing more visas, we're going to have a pretty serious problem. So I think that's where they are on the visa allocations.
And Representative Krishnamoorthi, can you talk about what your efforts have been and some of the congressional bipartisan efforts?
Sure. Well, it's hard to follow someone who actually literally wrote the book on immigration, but Ira, it's a real privilege and an honor to be on with you. I'm just a lowly congressman trying to get some laws passed to help reform the immigration system, which is royally screwed up right now. Ira pointed out the H-1B issue. I should just mention that not only are we seeing a real shortage of skilled workers necessary for the CHIPS Act, but for that matter, even implementing the bipartisan infrastructure deal, we're seeing a real shortage of engineers and people who can actually, come up with the plans to implement massive infrastructure projects throughout the country, whether they are road or construction projects or other types of projects. And then I should just mention that there's a silver tsunami going on in the medical profession as well, where you're seeing an acute shortage of, for instance, subspecialties and specialties like anesthesiologists and others. And so, I hope that we can resolve this immigration crisis before we get to other adverse consequences because of the shortage that we're seeing right now in all these different professions. That being said, it's been very difficult passing any type of immigration bill through Congress right now because of what's happening at the border. I and most of my colleagues agree that we need to tackle what's happening at the border in a rational, common sense manner. And there have been efforts, notably the Jim Lankford brokered compromise. He's a Republican senator from Oklahoma who came up with an excellent bill with Democrats and the White House, which got tanked by Donald Trump when Donald Trump decided he would rather run on the problem than try to solve it. All that said, me and a guy named Larry Bouchon from Indiana have partnered on several bipartisan immigration bills. I'll just talk about one for the moment. It's the Eliminating Backlogs of 2023 bill. Essentially what happens is, as you heard from Mala earlier, each country is capped at 7% of employment-based visas each year to matriculate into green cards, but many countries don't use their full allocation. And so you could have a situation, I'm making up these numbers, where Iceland might only use a fraction of its allocation and Sweden might only use another fraction. And so you have all these unused green cards for those countries. And in the past, they've been wasted. They have not been used to address the legitimate needs of countries such as India, where there's so many, oversubscriptions to the system. And so what we propose is to use the otherwise unallocated or unused visas, green cards for the people in queue. And just in 1 year, and I'll just take one example, in fiscal year 2021, there were 66,000 green cards that were unutilized. So that's a lot. And if you add them up over time, it ends up being a big number. We're trying to get that through the Judiciary Committee. Jim Jordan is the chairman, so wish me luck. Another bill that I think I've co-sponsored every single immigration bill in Congress at this point, but another one, which I should mention since Ira mentioned it before, is the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act. It's now called the EAGLE Act. It's a different name, but it's the same concept, which is to eliminate the per-country quotas. Kamala Harris was a supporter of that in the Senate, and we were this close to getting it passed through the Senate. It had passed the House when it got blocked at the last minute. But I suspect that she would continue to support it going forward. Me and Rich McCormick and Mala Bajpai are the primary sponsors of this bipartisan bill, and we're trying to work that. Finally, I'll just mention another piece of legislation called America's Children Act. There are a group of people called documented dreamers. It's kind of a group that unfortunately doesn't get a lot of attention. There are about 200,000 people who are the dependents of, let's say, H-1B visa holders. And they are legally here until the age of 21. And if their parent, father or mother who's the H-1B visa holder doesn't matriculate into permanent resident status, then the child ages out. And so they technically become undocumented at that point, and there is no program like DACA or any kind of work authorization program that would enable them to stay. So essentially, they would have to self-deport at that point. And it's one of the toughest situations that I've had to deal with as a congressman, where a parent comes into my office and tells me, meet this individual who happens to be my son, and he has spent almost his entire life here, came here when I was on my H-1B visa, and he's going to turn 21 next month, and we don't know what to do. And so as of now, essentially they have to find other visa categories to remain, such as international student visas. But, those are not easy necessarily. And it always seems like we're dealing with deadlines, and, we can barely get them into school in the nick of time and so forth. So all I can say is elections matter. And so I hope that when you talk to your member of Congress or Senate, for that matter, or presidential candidate, you ask them about these particular issues and you hold them accountable for where they stand on all these bills and others.
No, thank you so much, Representative Krishnamoorthi. That's perfect segue to the next topic, actually, which is documented dreamers and D3 waivers. As a practitioner, we face this all the time, where someone has spent their entire life here, but their kids have to leave for some reason to a country that they don't know, and it's heartbreaking, right? So it's a very important topic that I'm glad you kind of put the highlight on it, because not a lot of people know that your whole life can be uprooted, even though you've lived here pretty much all of your life. So on that note, Mr. Kurzban, do you want to kind of talk about the different policies?
Yeah. And one other thing I'd mention, I think particularly, Congress member, is the issue of derivatives. I've been kind of focused on this for a number of years. Now when we issue visas, we not only issue a visa to the principal, each family member gets a visa. And I've tried to litigate this issue and tried to get it done administratively. If we eliminated derivatives, in other words, if each family counted as one visa, the numbers that we would save would be staggering. I mean, it would eliminate most of the backlogs that we see today. So I think that's an important thing to look at. I know there's been some pushback by some Republicans, but others have supported the idea, at least for business immigration. I don't know that we'll be able to get it for business and not get it for family, but I think that's another avenue to explore in terms of dealing with the, dealing with the backlog. So let me talk about Dreamers and DACA. I mean, there couldn't be honestly a stronger contrast, I think, between the candidates, at least on DACA. Harris has supported DACA as a senator. She certainly supported it strongly as vice president. The position of, I think, Trump, and particularly of the Project 2025, is that they refer to DACA as an unlawful program. And I think you have to understand the kind of political and philosophical view that Trump and the people around him have, which is that any program that grants parole or any program that grants a benefit generally that isn't statutorily mandated is considered to be illegal. So they, and Vance said this about TPS, which we'll get to, which is kind of bizarre. But
any executive action, basically?
Yeah, he said that he thought, TPS was illegal because it's just done by the, kind of hand, somebody just decides it overnight, as if there wasn't an entire detailed process to give TPS. But the view is basically, they refer to DACA as an unlawful program. They've said that they would, basically do away with the program. They support, many of the states have sued, and as you know, that's going to be ultimately before the Supreme Court as to whether or not DACA will continue. If DACA doesn't continue, all of it falls away with respect to all those kids who have it. So I think this is one of those issues that has huge consequences depending on really who gets elected on November 5th. There are lots of ways, of course, in which to facilitate EB-5 and deal with the program that the Congress member has said, which has to do with people aging out. The administration has tried to deal with that now with waivers for people if they travel,
Right.
On 212D3 waivers as well, and trying to figure out other ways in which they can prolong it. But I think ultimately you're right. I think as a practical matter, it's probably going to have to be done by Congress, which is with respect to the Child Status Protection Act in some way carve out, even if we leave it as it is, to at least carve out those kids who have been here years and years due to the backlog. I think the way that the Child Status Protection Act was written really doesn't give the kind of protection that they were thinking about when you look at the children of Indian students or Chinese H-1B holders. So I think they're going to have to really focus on that in Congress and try and alter the CSPA to talk about what happens when we have such long-term visa backlogs and visa waits due to country limitations.
And Representative Krishnamoorthi, what's the kind of attitude on DACA and the CSPA, and is there a kind of spotlight on that right now?
I think on DACA, if I had to be honest, I think that when it first was unveiled, I think that my Republican colleagues, though they had deep sympathy, I mean, I'm talking about the ones who are acting in good faith. Obviously, there's always going to be people who are not, but the ones who are acting in good faith had deep reservations about it coming in the form of an executive order and not, as Ira mentioned, in the form of legislation. That being said, I think that, again, I go back to the border. I think that everything gets wrapped up in that at this point. My hope, let's see what happens on November 5th. Obviously, that's the number one, I think, hinge point or pivot point for what happens going forward. But there's a small possibility that maybe we can do something in the lame duck session, because as you know, so many people are retiring, they're leaving Congress, leaving the Senate. They might be willing to take a tough vote, a vote of conscience in their party. And so I, for one, if there's an opportunity, if it presents itself, I'm going to push for that. But again, I wouldn't hold my breath because things are just so toxic on this issue in Congress right now.
Do you think you'll be able to get more bipartisan support by distinguishing the documented dreamers from DACA who essentially came undocumented, like really making that fine line to try to get bipartisan support?
Possibly, but I think that if I had to be, again, frank, I think that some of my Democratic colleagues would be concerned about, undocumented or DACA folks kind of somehow seeming to be left in the lurch. I think that the truth of immigration right now, at least as I see it, is you kind of have to walk together as a coalition in a lot of ways to be able to, overcome the various legislative obstacles that present themselves, whether it's in getting a markup in the Judiciary Committee, or getting a floor vote, and of course breaking a filibuster. So given all those things, I think that having a documented dreamer and dreamer bill come up at the same time would make the most sense if Democrats are in charge. Now, if Republicans are in charge, I could see them pursuing a different tack. I do see them a little more sympathetic on the documented dreamers issue than on some of the other ones, as you can tell by the number of Republican co-sponsors on the documented dreamers bill. And so maybe we could get some progress on that if they were somehow to be spearheading the legislative agenda and of course the White House.
Do you think tying in the economy and business efforts would help kind of pass that immigration bill?
I don't know. I don't know anymore. I think it's it's become a culture issue, right? Cultural issue. Once it enters into the culture wars, reason and economics and logic don't necessarily carry the day. And so I do think that, let's just say, God forbid, in my opinion, Donald Trump became elected. The number of border crossings has gone down a ton, actually, over the last several months. I mean, it's dropped significantly. It's not something we talk about every day, but it's dropped significantly. At some point, I could see a Republican president just declare victory, like, I stopped everything. Everything is good. And then at that point, they take up certain limited immigration measures that would, help this group or that group and so forth.
Yeah, there just seems to be a gap between the 66,000 you mentioned that's unused and a lot of open positions within the field. We
were this close to getting the then Fairness for High Skilled Workers Act passed out of the Senate during the Trump administration. And Trump said he was going to sign this into law, and many people took him at his word. The problem is that Mitch McConnell at the time required unanimous consent on this bill. And what that ends up doing is it creates a lot of people who can act as holdouts. And so Rick Scott, you play whack-a-mole every day, where you have one senator who holds out, and then you say, okay, well, we'll do this to address your issue. And then he lowers his hand. And then the next day, Rick Scott raises his hand. It just became, one of these things where we ran out of time before we could whack all the moles at that point.
Representative, I know we have just a few minutes left with you before we have to go, but we wanted to hear, what can individuals on this webinar, people watching at home, what can they do to kind of support your efforts, bipartisan efforts, and also what can SABA as an organization do to deliver more of an impact in this immigration space?
We need to put maximum pressure on Jim Jordan in the House. He is the #1 obstacle at this point to getting any immigration bill whatsoever marked up in the Judiciary Committee. So I say to everybody, look, we all know people, maybe in Ohio or elsewhere, who have the ability to bring this to his attention as a constituent or as an interested party, for instance, in Ohio. And it's very important that he get on board with something, because if he doesn't get on board, then essentially nothing gets marked up. And everything, as you know, from an immigration standpoint, starts with the Judiciary Committee in the House, or at least requires. Now, if we take back the House, okay, then he will likely be the ranking member, and Jerry Nadler could be the chair, and we'll have much more leeway. But still, even as the ranker, he has certain powers that we're going to need to kind of hold in abeyance for these immigration bills. Now we turn to the Senate. I think right now, Dick Durbin is the chair of the Judiciary Committee, thank God. And we see a lot of good coming out of the Judiciary Committee. But Chuck Grassley, if he becomes the chair, not only would he be the oldest judiciary chairman ever at 91 years old, but he has some very pronounced views on immigration, not as hardline as Jim Jordan, but he's somebody that we need to cultivate as well at this point. So those are the two people. Obviously, I can't tell you about the White House. I don't know what's going to happen. And so all I can say is, I think that we should talk to our Republican colleagues and friends as much as possible about all these issues. And because that is really where, to me, we have to exercise whatever leverage we have to get them on our side. And the sooner the better on some of these common sense bills. Getting them as co-sponsors helps a ton, because it's less likely that they'll vote in an unpredictable way on that issue later on if they've co-sponsored the bill.
I just
Thank
had
you so much.
quite, I guess, the curiosity about the, the idea of the filibuster. I know, people have talked about ending it and stuff. Is there any like middle ground of going back to the old filibuster? I mean, when I grew up, somebody didn't have to, they had to actually get up and talk for all day and all night. And it really discouraged people from doing what they're doing today in Congress. And I'm just curious to know, is there anything like that being considered, or is it just an all or nothing proposition?
There is, but as you know, all of those types of changes require a vote. And, I think that there's always concerns. I personally have talked about creating carve-outs to the filibuster for various reasons, whether it's reproductive freedom or voting rights. But I think that the speaking filibuster reform that you are talking about is a very common sense one, and I think that it could command support to change the rules. But we need to change them, because as you can tell, the filibuster effectively creates the ability of a super minority in this country. Because remember how each state is represented by 2 senators, regardless of the population of the state. When you add up the number of people who could essentially filibuster, you end up with a super minority of the country that could prevent common sense legislation from coming to pass. So we got to reform it.
Thank you.
Thank
you, everybody.
So, do you want to go to the other issues, or do you have time?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Representative Krishnamoorthi. That was super valuable and helpful, and we really appreciate your time. And we'll get to the next issues. Mala, do you want to take it away?
Sure. We talked a little bit about H-1Bs earlier and part of the trajectory. The reason why we wanted to talk about it more is about 70% of all of the H-1B visa holders are from South Asian countries. Estimates say about 300 to 400,000 right now are in the US on H-1B visas. Now, unlike some visa categories like the L2 or E2, which your dependents do have work authorization, the H-1B dependents are called H-4, so spouses and children. We talked about aging out being an issue earlier due to the visa backlog. Well, until you get that approved labor cert, your spouse, H-4, does not have work authorization. So as a practitioner in Arizona, I see a lot of H-4 spouses are baking at home, delivering food, doing childcare, doing a lot of under the table things, and they're highly, highly educated. It seems like a logical connection with the labor shortage and lack of labor to promote H-4 EADs.
Especially since the other categories have work authorization, it's into status.
Exactly. And so some of the issues that we've seen in the past fluctuate among different administrations as just the delay in processing time, if they even are approved for an H-4 to get that authorization, taking over 2 years when it is a 2-year authorization. Or another thing that we see in some cases is that individuals are not able to leave dangerous situations because their visa status is tied to their primary visa holder for an H-1B. So we do have I-765V, which is for an abused spouse of an H-1B holder, but it doesn't give them underlying status. So this is definitely a really prevalent issue amongst many South Asians, and would love to hear from you, Ira, about, has anything been said by either of the candidates?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, again, this is one of those that appeared to be a stark difference. As you know, in 2019, the Trump administration tried to rescind the H-4 EAD program entirely. There was a big backlash because it would have meant that thousands of people would have just left the country at a time when, obviously we needed people. The Democrats have taken the position of expanding at least the time period for H-4s, so that you don't, now it's up to 540 days, right? You can get an extension of up to 540 days. But Trump and particularly the Project 2025 has talked about removing H-4 spouses from eligibility completely. But the interesting thing about it is, Trump is now saying at least that he would support the border bill that he is opposed. So we don't know where he really is. But in that border bill, it does expand work authorization to spouses of specialized H-1B workers, specifically STEM, back. So that would have an enormous effect if, in fact, that went through. And it also has a CSPA-style amendment, which preserves the dependent child status of individuals who age out. So if, in fact, let's say Trump wins and they support the border bill, Harris has said she will sign the border bill. My hope, of course, is that they put a bunch of other things in there before she signs it, but who knows? But even the bill as it is would certainly help H-1B spouses and would make a difference, I think, with children as well. So that's an important part of this whole kind of dynamic. Trump wins, he's saying he'll reinstitute the border bill. Who knows? Harris has said she'll sign it. So I think that issue is one of those where even though through his whole first term, he opposed the H-4 extensions and H-4 employment authorization, maybe they've had a change of heart on it. I don't know. I guess we'll have to wait on that one.
Yeah.
It's all about the economy.
Right. And then the last one is the TPS, which again, I don't think you could find a more stark difference between the candidates and the parties really on this, and the states. When you look at the
Mr. Kurzban, could you describe what TPS is, just for the non-immigration attorneys on the call?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's a couple of different things going on. One is TPS, which is temporary protected status. This was part of the 1990 legislation that Congress passed that said if a country is having turmoil, and it can be economic turmoil, I forget where it was, but there was one country that had a volcano. One of the islands in the Caribbean had a volcano, and we granted TPS to the people who were there, who were in the United States at the time. So it's economic, political, environmental. It has a whole series of criteria. And the way the TPS works is within the Department of State and within United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, there are a group of experts in each of these countries who talk about the country conditions, and if they've really degraded, we will give them TPS. And sometimes, if it gets even worse, we will expand TPS, which is what happened with Haiti. Haiti had an earthquake, and it's a good example. Haiti had an earthquake in 2010, destroyed much of the country, and particularly Port-au-Prince. We gave temporary protected status to the Haitians who were here. Then it had a hurricane that was even more destructive than some of our hurricanes in terms of the economy. We extended TPS to those people if they were in the U.S. after that. And then most recently, because of the violence, the gang violence in Haiti, they made a determination that it was not safe. So we then extended it to all the people who had come here, within the last year. So now there's a large population of TPS people who are here. And it goes, there's a whole detailed analysis. The reason why I know this is we sued the Trump administration originally on Haitian TPS because they just took it away they basically subverted the whole process at the time. They didn't follow any of the things that the experts had said, rewrote the report and said they were going to deny TPS. And so there is a process in place. It's a statutory process. But then there are all these other programs that the administration has enacted, not through Congress, but to alleviate the pressure at the border. So we have a parole program for people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, which the administration has recently said they may end. We have other parole programs, including what we now call parole in place, which the administration announced several months ago. We have had, specific parole programs for Ukrainians and people from Afghanistan.
And now, how is that different than asylum? And
right. Okay. Well,
and then can you
asylum is actually
talk about Trump
a
and
permanent
Harris's positions on that?
I mean, in a way, asylum, even though it's not, quote, permanent, if you get asylum, after a year and a day, if conditions have not changed, you can apply and get a green card. Parole is just a temporary permission to come into the US. They can revoke parole whenever they want. They can say, we're not going to extend it, which is what they did actually with Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Venezuela recently. They said they're not going to extend the parole. And so some of those people, technically have to leave the country. And the same thing is true, obviously, with people from Afghanistan and Ukraine who don't otherwise qualify for residency in another way. So all of those groups will, at some point, if they're just on parole, that parole can be revoked. Project 2025 and Trump regard all of these groups, and now we're talking really hundreds of thousands of people in the US, as illegally here. And they would revoke all of them. They would revoke all the parole programs because they believe it's a misuse of parole. The states have sued on many of the, the so-called red states, particularly led by Texas, Florida, and a few other states have sued on all of these parole programs, basically saying that people shouldn't be here and shouldn't be allowed to remain in the US, that it's a misuse of parole. Vance has said, as I alluded to before, TPS is just by the wave of a hand, which of course is not true, but it shows you the mentality of what they think of all these programs. And Trump has made it absolutely clear that they would revoke most of the TPS programs. Which ones will stay and which ones won't, we don't know. The Biden administration has substantially expanded TPS when there have been demands from different countries like Cameroon, at one point Liberia, and other countries as well. And the point is that Trump saying that he's going to do away with them is actually in clear violation of law, because it's the decision of the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. This just isn't a formality. It's the Secretary, after he gets or she gets detailed reports about the conditions in the country. So Trump now saying he's going to do away with them is clearly a violation of law and demonstrating that it's arbitrary and capricious. He doesn't have the authority to do it. It's the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, obviously, he can appoint somebody who will do it, but they have to do it according to the procedures, which is what happened when we sued them and got TPS reinstated for the Haitians when they revoked it in 2019. Okay, so those are the four things you had asked me, I think.
The case for asylum as well, is that something that we should, depending on, which administration wins, what's your outlook on the asylum program under Harris and Trump?
Oh, okay. I think on the asylum program, you're seeing a bipartisan in a way, although they never call it that, bipartisan view of restricting the procedures for asylum at the border. As Congressman Krishnamoorthi said before, you know, the numbers at the border have dramatically decreased to the point where there are less people coming to the border than there were under Trump pre-COVID. So it's a substantial reduction. You know, if you didn't know that, you would think, you know, millions and millions of people coming over the border, but it's just not so at the present time. And part of that is that they believe it's attributable to the restrictions they're placing on asylum and the fact that the border is closed. I think one thing people don't understand about what Biden did is the restriction at the border of people who try to come in illegally and shutting down the border is as restrictive and maybe even more restrictive than what Trump did. It's just that the way they defined it is to say the border, you know, when we think about the border, we often think about the southwest border. If you look at the regulations and the presidential proclamation when Biden closed the border, he said the border will not be reopened until there are less than 1,500 people coming in each day. But then they define the border as Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Florida, Louisiana, all of the southwest border. So it is a huge area. The chances of ever getting to that less than that 1,500, it seems to me, are very, very small. And then 2 weeks ago, they amended it to say that it also includes unaccompanied minors, because they exempted unaccompanied minors from that 1,500. Now they're including them. And of course, there are more unaccompanied minors coming in, and they, you know, they tweaked it in a couple of other ways that make it almost impossible, in my view at least, to see that 1,500 reduced. At the same time, they have now initiated asylum regs, which are pretty tough, but not as tough as I think they would be if there's a Trump administration. I mean, I think they've made it very clear in the 2025 project as to really kind of shutting down asylum. And so, for example, the 2025 project says we want to take out of the definition a particular social group. And as you know, many of the people in asylum, in order to get asylum for the people who are immigration lawyers out there, you have to show that you'd be persecuted on the basis of race, religion, national origin, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. But if you read the cases, many of these cases, I would say 80% are a particular social group. In other words, like I'm from Guatemala, and I'm a woman who's been subject to domestic violence. It's not race, religion, national origin, or politics. It's how we've defined a particular social group. They want to do away with particular social groups, which would literally mean probably 80% of the people applying for asylum would no longer be eligible. So they're talking about drastic cuts. I think what Biden tried to do is balance it. You know, it's still more restrictive than it has been, but what they've done is they've kind of tweaked it in the sense of you have to show, you know, a reasonable possibility. If you can't show a reasonable probability now versus a reasonable possibility, then you don't meet the threshold and they can send you back. They're still using the return policy of people in Mexico saying you have to now use an app, you know, with CBP1 in order to be able to get an appointment to come across the border. So they are doing things to restrict people, which I think is in pretty blatant violation of the international convention that we signed. We signed the protocol relating to the status of refugees. And just so the people listening know the background, the convention relating to the status of refugees was signed, I think, in 1952. Originally, we signed the protocol in 1967, but the whole idea came out of World War II, where people were trying to get into other countries. Jews were trying to get into Switzerland at the time, and they would just turn back. In other words, there was no process. They just didn't want the people, and they said, no, we're not going to let you in. So the whole notion of asylum is fundamentally that the countries who have signed this cannot simply throw people back. It's called refoulement. You can't just throw people back at the border. We're coming closer to that than we've ever come, I think, since we signed the protocol in 1967, but that's where we are right now. I just wanted to, if it's okay, I wanted to take a few minutes to just go over the numbers at the election, if that's something that people you think would be interested in hearing about how close the
We
election
definitely,
is.
yeah, we only have a few minutes left. We'll definitely have you touch on it. I think one of the things Rohit and I just wanted to circle back on is why are we talking about TPS and asylum and border crossings when we're talking to South Asian voters, it's not in the mainstream media usually, but the number 3 country coming over undocumented is India. It's Mexico #1, China #2, and India. And TPS is already in place for Nepal, Burma, Myanmar. It's not in place for Bangladesh, but these are issues that are affecting South Asians, which may not be in the mainstream media.
And they're coming over the Canadian border too. So
yeah.
One of the less talked about borders.
Right.
And increased claimants of asylum as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely why we wanted to touch on the topic today. Could you briefly talk about the Afghan Adjustment Act and if there's any updates on that or future? Are people...
I didn't see, there is a discussion about the Afghan Adjustment Act, but I didn't, they're talking about allowing more people in, and of course, there has been this issue of what to do, ultimately with the program. Right now, I think the board, again, goes back to the Border Act that, Trump blocked. It allows Afghans classified as U.S. allies to be deemed refugees and entitled to special DOS protection or immediate removal from Afghanistan. It extended the SIV status to Afghan immediate relatives of U.S. military or veterans, and it would allow asylum applications to work while their applications are pending. So I think a lot of this, Mala, is going to turn on the border bill. My sense is whoever wins, the border bill is going to get passed in one way or another. So I think there are those provisions in there because, the problem we've had in terms of Afghanistan is getting the people out of the country. We've tried different things, parole. That's why they have that expanded parole program just for people from Afghanistan to get them out as quickly as possible. The border bill, I think, addresses it in a more concrete way and would have a substantial effect.
Okay. We have 2 questions in the chat. One is from Roli Kare. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. To summarize, he's talking about as immigration practitioners, we saw an increase in RFE, requests for evidence, and H-1B denials. And so his specific question is, would Trump try to use similar but turbocharged delay tactics and cumbersome procedures, public charge, to make the process much worse for employment-based immigration and their attorneys?
Yeah, I think if Trump wins, we're going to see, the same kinds of things that we saw before. I think they know because they're very, the people who were around Trump on immigration are people who know immigration very, very well. And they know internally kind of the guts of how the system operates. And, my view is they just want to crash the system. I mean, I know that they've talked about high-tech people and they may allow some in, but basically, if you look at what they did with H-1Bs the last time, there was a 22 or 27% denial rate because they changed the definitions of H-1Bs. When that was enjoined, the denial rate dropped to 2%. So we're going to see more of those kinds of things. We're going to see backlogs, more backlogs, and they put a provision in the 2025 program that says if there are backlogs that are substantial, we can stop accepting applications. Not just adjudicating them,
Right.
we will stop administratively accepting applications. Well, you can imagine what that means. I mean, look at the employment, look at where we are now with efforts over the last 4 years to try and reduce those backlogs. If you have people in the agency who really want to increase the backlogs, who are saying the only thing that's important is fraud detection, take your time, figure out what you need to do on the applications, which is what basically Trump did. In other words, they raised the bar so high on fraud and everything else and on misstatements. Many of you know this who practice that, for example, you apply for citizenship and it used to be, and I've been doing this obviously a long time, they would encourage people to become citizens. They wanted people to be citizens. Now it's really the reverse. They go back and they fly spec every single application you ever made, a DS-160 when you applied for a non-immigrant visa, and your DS-260, and they try to find some kind of material misrepresentation to say you're not validly a resident. So what you have now are these huge backlogs that are starting again. When Trump left office, there was a 750,000 backlog just on citizenship. And that number's come down substantially. But imagine doing that on H-1Bs, doing it on EB-1s, the EB-2s. So, you know, what the question really is yes, I think what they're going to do is they're going to do the same thing they did before, but in a more organized way, which is to fly spec all these applications and make it impossible.
And I think you had a note about prevailing wages as well for H-1Bs that they're going to increase as well if it comes up.
Yeah, and they have said that. They've said, here's what they plan to do. Focus less on reducing processing times and more on eligibility and fraud, just what I was talking about. H-1B transformed into an elite program for only the top foreign workers at the highest wage. So we don't know what that means, but it certainly means they're going to cut it down, limit availability of fee waivers, increase fees across the board by 10%, and anyone rejected for a visa or extension must leave immediately from the United States. And what I said before, pause intake of new applications whenever backlogs get too long. And, you know, that's consistent with their view. I mean, they do not want to have many people entering the country. They may try to do a workaround because we obviously need people to do the CHIPS program. And as the Congress member said, to also do the IRA, you know, the other program that requires engineers, you know, doctors, otherwise, and medical personnel. We have a huge shortage in the country. So I don't know what they're going to do, but certainly immigration's not going to be the vehicle for them to do it, because their view is fraud is the most important thing.
Thank you, Ira. I want you to have time to do your concluding remarks, but I think you have 1 minute till your next panel.
Okay, I just wanted to tell everybody about what the numbers are. So, you know, the whole election's in the 7 states. Right as of October 22nd, Trump is leading in Arizona, 48% to 46. He's leading in Georgia, 48 to 47. In Michigan, Harris is leading 47.5 to 47.2. Same thing more or less in Nevada. Harris is leading. North Carolina, Trump is leading by 1 percentage point. Pennsylvania, it's almost a dead heat. Trump is leading by 47.8 to 47.6. Pennsylvania is the election, as everybody, I think, it knows now. Wisconsin, Harris is leading by 0.5%. These are all, and they're all within the margins of error. And what I wanted to point out is, one of the things we do on behalf of Immigrants List is look at the numbers. Like in Arizona, right? Biden won by 10,000 votes. There are people from the AAPI community, 148,000 votes. In the Latinx community, there's 1.1 million votes. So in all of these elections, you're talking about an infinitely small number of people. Georgia, 11,000 votes. The AAPI community in Georgia is 282,000 people. So how people vote in these elections is enormously important. Michigan, it's the same way. I mean, I can go through each one, but the point is, we work in immigrant communities because the immigrant vote can really make the difference in every single one of these states because the elections are that close. And there are large populations of people from Southeast Asia in each of these states. They're located in different places. Like in Georgia, I never knew that there was such a large, South Asian population. I mean, I didn't think of it in those terms, but so those will make the difference. So whatever your view is, go and vote. That's all I can say.
Think.
Definitely want to echo Ira's sentiment in terms of the South Asian Bar Association. Regardless of who you vote, your vote is private, but your voting record is public. And we amplify our voice as a community when we get out and vote, regardless of who you vote for. So just wanted to encourage everyone who hears this and sees this to definitely vote.
Yeah, and I hope we informed you guys about a little bit about the immigration topics. After this, we're actually going to send out a chart, an election primer about the stances for both candidates on immigration for the various topics we spoke about, but also some other topics as well. So stay tuned for that. That you can have a little sheet if immigration does influence your vote when you are voting. And thank you so much. Thank you to Mala, Mr. Kurzban, Representative Krishnamoorthi. Also, thank you to Akansha, Latika, and Rahil for putting this together. I know I'm a little bit smarter than I was about an hour ago. So thank you so much again. And it was great hanging with you all.
Thank
you so
you.
much, Ira.
It's always a pleasure, Mala, Rohit. It's always a pleasure to come and talk to people. And, I'm always happy to come back.
We'll see you next time.
Year or the year after.
Yeah, see you next year.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.